Hi, everyone. It's 4 o'clock Central European Summertime, meaning that it's time to start. So good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Welcome everyone on behalf of the entire ZEVWISE coalition to this very first webinar of the ZEVWISE series, in which we tackle key issues and expand our collective wisdom on the accelerated uptake of zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicles. More specifically, welcome everyone to today's webinar on the topic of strategic network planning. My name is Rosan Nusseler, and I'm very happy to be moderating this session today. I'm an advisor on sustainable mobility at the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, which is the implementing body for sustainable mobility of the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. At the NEA, we really bridge the gap between policymakers on the one hand and the business community on the other. And I think that bringing together governments and other stakeholders is definitely one of the topics that will be addressed today as well. But before we get into any more details, let me quickly go through some housekeeping. If we can go to the next slide, please. So please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Please, if possible, add your name and affiliation so that we know who's in the room. Hold your questions until the Q&A. Presentations and discussions will be recorded, but the Q&A will not. So that's going to be under Chatham House rules so that everyone feels more freely to speak and to ask questions to our speakers. All right, so because this is the very first webinar of the ZEVWISE series, let me take a brief moment to explain to you what are the ZEVWISE objectives. Please go to the next slide. So as the audience may well be aware of, an accelerated uptake of zero-emission medium heavy-duty vehicles is wise. It is also very much needed in order to bring the emissions of freight transport in line with the Paris Agreement. Policy ambitions are strongly voiced by OEMs, by governments, and those ambitions hold a promise. But it will take policy and it will take action to really deliver on that full potential. So the ZEVWISE series aims to expand the collective wisdom on the uptake of these zero-emission buses and trucks and to deliver tangible ambition and action on ZEVWISE policies. Organized by the 12 ZEVWISE partners who are shown in the upper right corner, this series of global live and online events will address two major barriers for the accelerated uptake of zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicles, which is energy infrastructure on the one hand and finance on the other. So for today's session, we will focus on the aspect of infrastructure as we will dive deeper into the topic of strategic network planning. So how do we strategically plan for a timely rollout of charging and refueling infrastructure in order to support that transition to 100% sales of zero-emission buses and trucks in 2040? I think we all agree that accelerating the rollout of this infrastructure is foundational for a swift transition. And with all these high ambitions and regulations even in place, understanding and tackling the key issues related to this timely rollout is really an urgent objective. So I'm really happy to be having this session today. We hope to examine issues like what factors should be taken into account when planning the necessary infrastructure. What is the role of governments? How can they spur early market growth? How can they facilitate the required scale for energy infrastructure? And which best practices exist when it comes to bringing all the necessary parties to the table? That brings me to our agenda. So in a minute, we're going to start with 4 pitches from our 4 speakers. We're trying to really make an interactive webinar, which is why I've chosen 4 short pitches instead of longer presentations. Each of our 4 speakers will have 5 minutes to present their most relevant message to you regarding the strategic approach to network planning. I will be introducing our speakers in a moment. After that, there's going to be a moderated discussion, so 15 minutes. And followed by the interactive Q&A session with the audience. And like I mentioned before, the Q&A session at the end will not be recorded so that you can ask your questions more freely. that's the program for today. I would say let's stop sharing the slides and I'll introduce to you our first speaker, who is Sophie Punten. Unfortunately, Sophie Punten was not able to attend this webinar today, but she did record a pitch for us to show to you. Let me quickly go back. So Sophie is the founder and board member of the Smart Freight Center, and she's working on a framework showing what it takes to get zero-emission trucks running. I'm very pleased to share with you Sophie's pre-recorded message. So please go ahead, Kate. Thank you. I'm sorry, does anyone hear the video message? Because I can't.
No, we can't.
No, no.
I still can't hear the message, unfortunately.
No, me neither. I'm sorry.
Kate, would you like to try one more time, or shall I head to the next speaker first and we try again?
Hello, I would like to present today on making
great.
the transition to electric trucks work, and specifically focusing on charging infrastructure. My name is Sophie Punten. I'm the founder and board member of Smart Freight Center. I'm on the supervisory board of MyLens and on the Sustainability Advisory Council of DHL. The challenge we're facing is that electric trucks are coming, but the charging infrastructure right now is a bottleneck. And different stakeholders are needed, but each hold a piece of the puzzle and no one can do it alone. So our idea is to create an actionable framework for stakeholders to advance electric trucks, focusing on both public and private charging infrastructure, commercial trucks that are bigger than 3.5 tons, and focusing on the EU and UK. And we do this in collaboration with Coalstart, Transport and Environment, Smart Freight Center, and the Netherlands Ministry for Infrastructure and Water Management. We have several starting points. We have different electric trucks, whereby the battery electric truck is the most predominant and fastest growing. Second is operations and applications, including round trip and last mile, regional, often going between depots, and long distance. Now, on charging locations, we have both private and public locations. And charging systems include combined charging system, megawatt charging system, electric road systems, and battery swapping. And finally, this can all be combined with charging strategies, including smart charging, vehicle to building or grid, and battery storage or energy storage systems. Now, the key is that stakeholders are many. They include governments, truck and equipment manufacturers, freight companies and their customers, grid operators, charging providers, civil society, and finance. And all of them have a role to play. And then the starting point is EU plans, policies, and regulations. The European Green Deal was enshrined in the European Climate Law and is supported by the Fit for 55 package to get the EU to 55% emission reductions by 2030. On the left, you see transport plans, overarching sustainable and smart mobility strategy, and then various plans and policies. For example, the A4 was just approved recently. And on the right, you see plans for other sectors. For example, the Renewable Energy Directive is really important if we want to charge our trucks in the future with renewable energy. And the final starting points are the conditions for eTruck charging. These include that electric trucks are on the market to create demand, plans and policies are in place for the medium and long term, land slots are made available for charging charging sites and permitting for charging sites is accelerated. Grids meet electricity demands needed for charging. The charging infrastructure and services are operational. The data is available and accessible, for example, for truck drivers who want to book a charging spot. Business and finance models support the transition both to electric trucks and supporting charging infrastructure. And finally, stakeholders are coordinated and collaborative. All of this to create a work to advance charging infrastructure. That means that those 9 questions I just explained, be planning what is the specific need, what is the current situation, what are key measures and opportunities to improve that, examples and sources already available we can use. And
So there seems to be some technical problems, I think.
The video does seem to have lost its audio. Would you like to go on to the next presenter?
Okay, that's a shame. Yes, well, if it's not working, let's continue. I think we've seen more than halfway of the video. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me? Rosanne, can you hear me?
Yes.
Maybe you can, of course, with sound it will be better, but at least to read the slides.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because it's interesting. Yeah. Okay, it's there. So yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much. Okay, let's do that. So I'm not entirely sure, but I'm just going to start with this slide right here where I see it. So when it comes to grids meeting electricity demand, the specific need is that there's going to be grid capacity, and future requirements from EV charging are known. In the current situation, the grid capacity expansion is behind as DSOs are starting. Their starting point is a customer request for expansion rather than anticipation of future demand. Key opportunity is then revised regulatory frameworks to encourage DSOs to timely invest in grid connection capacity. And examples and sources, maybe I think just because of time reasons, let's skip this and go to the next slide. If we can. Is it possible to go to the next slide? Or?
Because it's not a slide, it's actually a video.
Yeah, I understand. So it's not possible to move into the video.
It's grid extensions for charging infrastructure could be given priority over other grid expansion requests, for example, industry. And the second example is New York State, where there's a proposed amendment to the law that will require future-proofing of the electric network and interconnection upgrades for the highway charging hubs. And of course, this will allow the DSOs to also be more proactive. Listening, and please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
All right, so our apologies for the technical errors, but I'm very happy that we could in the end listen to Sophie's story. So very interesting, she's not here today, of course, but many thanks to Sophie for sharing this. Let's quickly go to our next speaker, who is Julia Hildermeijer, Senior Associate EU Program at the Regulatory Assistance Project. Julia is an e-mobility and transport expert working really at the cross-section of energy and transport policy. So thank you so much for being here, Julia, and feel free to share your screen and take it off.
Thank you, Rosanne, and hi everyone. I trust that you can see me and hear me well and see my slides. Let me know if it's not the case. Let me quickly present myself and RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project. We are a group of policy advisors working on the clean energy transition in the US, Europe, India, and China. And I lead our work on e-mobility or electrification of transport in our Europe team based in Brussels, Belgium. So when we look at EVs, we're looking at them as both a means of transport and a resource for the power system, or a battery on wheels. And the basic challenge we're seeing when it comes to strategic network planning, the topic of today's webinar, is that electricity demand by all types of EVs is growing as they require to be connected to the grid via charging infrastructure. And this represents additional demand to the power system. And if that additional demand by electric vehicles is not integrated and managed in an optimal way, this adds cost to the system that is higher than it would be if it was optimized in the first from the start in the first go. And that in the end will create cost of charging, but also cost to build new charging infrastructure, because more capacity will have to be planned and paid for by the system. So this additional cost will eventually risk to slow down the entire energy transition. In other words, and put more positively, we need to plan for integrating EVs into the power grids optimally now, and that way save costs for consumers, for the grid, and the environment. So that's for the big picture. The key to optimize EV charging, and according planning of the charging network, but also of the electricity network behind the charging network, is smart charging. And we can define that as charging EVs automatically at times when cost of electricity are lowest without compromising the user's needs. So smart charging really creates this double win. It generates individual savings, for example, for truck fleet operators that optimize charging of trucks at the depot during their them being parked overnight to when electricity is cheapest. But it also, that way, these savings also create savings in the system overall. So in turn, this reduces cost for all consumers' electricity bills, even those that are not at all involved in charging electric trucks. And that's a really big societal additional benefit that I wanted to point out. So depending on the flexibility, or say the truck charging window, charging can be moved into cheaper hours, which also helps to absorb more renewables. And in order for smart EV charging to work, pricing of charging needs to be cost reflective. And that's really the fundamental condition that helps consumers, for example, fleet operators, reap the benefits of smart charging. Smart charging only makes sense if the consumer sees at which hours charging is cheaper, because charging energy, the energy for charging is cheaper because renewables, cheap renewables are available in the system, but also the use of the electricity network to charge, for example, the fleet of electric trucks is cheaper because the network has capacity and can be used at a specific moment. For example, overnight, because less of general consumption is on the grid at the same time. So this cost-reflective pricing is really key to help us optimize charging of ever more electric vehicles connected to the system. In an earlier study with the ICCT, in fact, we've analyzed data from electric truck fleets in 6 different European cities, and we found that depot owners can save up to 15,000 euros annually, and that was 10 to 15% of the total energy cost at the time, with smart charging by saving on network pricing. And in further up work, we also checked that this is still the case even with high energy prices. So this is interesting from the consumers and system benefits. So what's behind smart grid integration? You can see that in this summary graphic. And what we're seeing today is that unfortunately grids are one of the main bottlenecks to build out or to make smart charging happen and to optimize EV grid integration. And particularly so on distribution grid level. So that's at the left bottom corner of this summary graph. And there's some factors to explain this. I'll just name a few very quickly. There's a very diverse landscape across Europe. You'll see countries in which there's basically one grid operator, such as in France, Enedis, I think, owns 95 or 98% of the network, up to 880 distribution system operators working in different areas in Germany. So you see that the policy challenge is a bit different. And there's also a different level of digitalization of, let's say, grid operators and the way they manage the networks. Some operators are anticipating added demand from EVs connected to their system, and they're participating in pilots to help charging them in a most optimal way. Other smaller DSOs, often in rural and less densely populated areas, don't have yet digital meters in place, so they can actually understand in real time how their grid is used. And likewise, transparency requirements on disclosing this data on grid use, as well as requirements on network investment plans and network development plans, is still quite different across EU member states, also depending on the size of DSOs. So what's needed in terms of grid-related policies to address this bottleneck, to make smart EV charging happen? This graph already gives you an idea that there's probably more than one area which we need policy, and I'll try to be brief just in summarizing the main policy areas where action is needed. On the charging infrastructure side, Sophie has already mentioned it in her video. The new EU charging infrastructure law, the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, or short AFIR, requires member states to set up capacity targets for charging electric trucks in the next coming years. But it also requires that all new charging points shall be smart charging capable. And that is really crucial to boost a market for third parties such as smart charging service suppliers, aggregators, to offer tariffs and services at EV charging points that help optimize charging, depending on the time and the vehicles spent at the charging point and the flexibility they can offer. And of course, the capacity at which they require charging and the size of the batteries. But you cannot offer any of these services if you don't know what's happening on the grid and if you don't have any price incentives to optimize in the first place. And for this to happen, charging infrastructure, charging points need to be able to measure and communicate consumptions. So depot owners or developers of truck charging infrastructure, for instance, will have an incentive to optimize and develop business models and have competitive prices that they can pass on to their customers. On the energy market side of things.
Sorry to interrupt. Just being mindful of time, maybe go to some closing remarks.
So these are actually the last areas of my last slide. On the energy market side of things, so that's the three circles here in the bottom. The reform of the EU energy market that's ongoing has also some really helpful provisions that we'd like to see in the final version that would help to better reward EV's flexibility as system resources. So more reflective pricing will help to build value from smart charging services. And there are some provisions that help make local grids smart charging ready. For instance, grid operators are required to share data on what's happening on their grids. I'm very happy to go into detail on these energy market reforms, as that's something that is less known to many transport stakeholders, but equally important to help smart network planning and smart charging to happen. So to summarize, let me just conclude by saying, to reduce the cost of transportation electrification and to sort of accelerate the energy transition, we need cost-reflective pricing of energy and networks in place. We need transparency of grid use and for operators, and we need immediate and detailed planning of charging infrastructure where mobility demand is, but also where the grid offers capacity to make EV grid integration work with most benefits for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julia, for sharing this. Because of time reasons, I'm gonna head immediately to our next speaker, who is David Elvey. David is head of the Future Freight Plan at the UK Department for Transport. So please, David, feel free to share your screen and take it away.
So I hope you can see my screen. Maybe someone could just shout out yes.
Yes.
Yes, brilliant. So good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is David Elvey. I'm from the UK Department for Transport, and I lead a piece of work on long-term planning for the freight system, actually, not just for trucks. The plan we published last year actually contained the insights sort of directly related to this conversation. The concern amongst the wider freight sector about the provision of energy infrastructure to support the transition to net zero. So I will focus on trucks in this conversation, but we're actually trying to think about this across the freight system. So we were asked to think about factors, and I started to make a list. I think the message from this screen is probably there are many factors, all interdependent with each other. And it's the job of government and industry, I think, to work their way through these in a kind of logical and coherent manner. I've drawn a few out in red text, which I'll focus on given the sort of the 5-minute limitation. But I mean, you need to provide some regulatory and policy clarity. Probably most importantly within this is to be really clear that you will at a point in time, and a point in time that will not move, not be permitted to buy new internal combustion engine HDVs. That's your backstop, the most powerful regulatory tool you have. And then you need to work through a series of other regulatory tools around energy markets, wider transport decarbonisation, your planning framework, national planning policy framework in the UK will be critical. And then you've got to think through technological readiness. So that's particularly in the case of the UK, where we don't really have any original equipment manufacturers. Got to understand what's happening amongst those manufacturers elsewhere in the world and follow that development, their delivery sort of schedules, and of course the range of the vehicles that they will be delivering. One way in which we're going to track that in the UK is through zero-emission road freight demonstration project. So that's sort of multiple consortia of large freight operators practicing, for want of a better word, with battery electric, hydrogen fuel cell and catenary trucks, where the infrastructure and the vehicles are provided by the UK government. It's been a long sort of history of needing to understand how HGVs move. That sort of has informed our road and rail investment programs over many years, but I think it becomes even more critical when you're thinking about the energy infrastructure needed to support them. So you need to understand how the freight flows. We're pretty good at that. You need to have a pretty clear understanding of where the operating centres are. I think this is a point that's often missed. A lot of charging will take place not on public land, but on private land where the vehicles are stored overnight. These are, for historic reasons, often located in the middle of nowhere. Nobody wants a big vehicle HGV centre around the back of their house, and they are naturally not provided with significant energy. Need to know where the warehousing is, need to know where the distribution hubs are. And you need to sort of understand more about how the market itself operates. How financially robust is it? Try to figure out its adoption curve. Who are your sort of early adopters? Who are your pioneers? Think about the secondary market for battery electric trucks in particular, and I think focus on the customers of freight. So what are the big retailers going to be driving in that space? So that, if you like, is the sort of the transport side. Then on the energy side, got to have a full understanding of the current capacity of your transmission and distribution system. And then the energy sector want to understand the spatial demand. So that brings us back to sort of warehousing operating centres. You know, where do they need to put in these high energy charging systems? They need to understand the adoption timetable, and I think, as others have mentioned, need to understand the time of day that the grid is going to be put under pressure. So the main factor then is think about teamwork, and we'll come to that on the next slide. It's a multidiscipline, and you need awareness and understanding across all of it. I've only put 3 currencies down there. I recognise that other currencies exist, but there's a big question around money. Obviously, who pays for this is a critical sort of policy and market consideration. But I think, and I would also add to the who pays, I think there's a very important consideration about when can that money be most effectively spent. So then we're asked to think about how you bring all the parties to the table. So this is a sort of a schematic of the UK Freight Energy Forum. So this is one of the actions from the plan I described in my introduction. So this is now up and running. Again, I'm not going to go through every box and square and circle on this, but to note, it's very similar to the first presentation in terms of the sort of the players you need to involve. So you need to have, start at the top middle, your regulator, in the UK, Ofgem. You need to involve the original equipment manufacturers, the ministries, departments as we call them in the UK, so transport and energy, but I've also put planning down here. This is a massive land use question, not just a transport and energy question. I want to highlight the red box that says OZEV. That stands for the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles. So this is a combined transport and energy department office. It's been in existence for about a decade, so it's well established. It's traditionally focused on cars and light vans, but it has the sort of capability to expand that offering into the HGV market. You need to understand your freight customers and your freight operators. I think I've sort of described that a bit already. And then you've got the infrastructure providers. So in this case, you've obviously got your road builders. In the UK, that's the National Highways. But also you've then got your energy system. I put transmission distribution there. You've also obviously above transmission, you will have the generators, and then you've got the retailers below. I think it's important to remember that there's a lot of focus in this debate on putting plugs in, but actually in the early stages of sort of building a network capable of coping with full transition, actually a lot of the opportunity probably exists within the transmission area rather than within the plug sockets. So the terms reference this group, they're going to focus on an HGV energy infrastructure plan. That's the main focus for the next 12 months, I think, but always taking into account the fact that the HGV sort of system does not exist in isolation from the wider freight network. So where you're putting big investments into energy provision for the road system, you might also want to think where you can make savings in terms of future rail or maritime requirements. And then asked to say, how can we spur growth, facilitate the required scale? This is a cheat slide, so I've literally taken a screenshot of my previous 2 slides. I think there's a temptation always to throw money at this problem, but I think actually the true answer to this is you identify and work through the factors on the first slide, and you do that in collaboration with the right stakeholders. The second slide, you're not necessarily looking for a really sudden forward leap. You're just trying to bring the curve forward. If you bring it forward by 6 months, that will accumulate massive carbon savings over a 30-year period. And I think that's it. Yep. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing and we can move on.
Thank you so much, David, for this. I think we couldn't agree more to your last statement. So work through the relevant factors with the right stakeholders. That makes a lot of sense to me. So thanks a lot. Next up is Rick Arends. Let me see. Rick is director at the Smart Freight Buyers Alliance at the Smart Freight Center. And in his capacity as director, he helps the largest shippers in the world to accelerate their decarbonization in collaboration with their supply chain partners. So very happy to have you here today. Rick, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roseanne, and hope everyone can see the screen correctly, and please shout out if not yet correctly. It's my pleasure to talk to you a bit about some of the strategic network planning in the context of the ZEVWISE series, which I'm quite excited about, that we're trying to really have this elevation of this platform to start discussions about how to scale battery electric vehicles across different nations. As we see, and at Smart Freight Center, we are really we're a center of organization where freight and logistics comes together in all of its aspects. And we work closely with all of our partners, in particularly cargo owners, their logistics service providers, and provide strategies and work with them actually on how you can make that scalability of logistics, decarbonization and reality and scalability of battery electric vehicles. And from the reality, what we see is actually that virtually every large organization that is a bit serious about sustainable logistics and thinks about this has now trialed 1 truck, 2 trucks, 5 trucks. Those that are running urban delivery centers, of course, they have quite a bit of more running already of electric trucks and a bit more experience. And we know quite a bit of how it looks like, but we don't know everything either. And this is going to be the journey that we need to go through. And then you see from the conversations that we have had before, there's actually a lot that can be done already and that we know, but there's also some elements that we still need to recognize. And I wanted to talk you through a few things that this transition that we are going through in terms of the strategic network planning is something that we know how it should probably look like in 2040 when we have a full rollout of battery electric trucks and everything can be running electric across different solutions. And we know where we are today. And this is where the messy middle sometimes comes into how we can actually solve some of this. If you just give or take, we roughly know how it should look like. And we know this because of the anticipated transport demands and also some of the legislation that has been put in place on the back of the different researches that we've done. I've shown you here a few maps from the European context for France, but also in California, where different mapping exercises can show based on transport volumes. And you clearly see some of the main highways of the 10T corridors in Europe, or some of the interstate highways in California, but also in the US at wider scale, where you see where truck stops immediately also trigger then a form of charging infrastructure need. Or where industrial estates are, where, for instance, logistics depots are. If we then look into reality of in practice, where and how are we going to charge? And Julia alluded to this already, when there's a lot of overnight charging, and this is actually confirmed also in practice, where we anticipate that if you talk about the distribution of daily charging needs, that 90%, and this is a serious number, and this is quite different therefore also from thinking about the diesel age that we are coming from and the fossil age to the battery electric trucks, is that a lot of it will be actually at destination or business locations, which means at distribution centers or terminals or those locations where loading and unloading takes place, where charging infrastructure will be deployed. And on the back of that, there's a lot about depot charging, and to some extent then about shared charging infrastructure at the industrial areas. If you then think about the 10% of on-the-go charging, which we call, so this is along highways or along the route needed for the longer distances, recognizing that also 80 to 90% in many regions actually in the world is not running very long distances. The truck distances in Europe are below 200 kilometers for the majority of all transport actually. So we always think about the problems for the very long distances, which is a realistic problem, but we need to recognize that a lot of transport is still relatively regional haul that we solve, and therefore need to recognize accordingly. If you think then about where that on the go also is, then you see also that there's a difference between truck parking areas and truck service areas where they go. It also is driven by some of this legislation information that we know. So in Europe, there's the AFIR has been describing the minimum requirements for the interstate and for the highway network on its rollout, and how to actually make sure that we get to a comprehensive network. And how does that look like then in how we see this transition and the scalability of charging infrastructure from where we are today to where it's going to look like in 2040. This is not a transition that will take place overnight, as mentioned. We really see, and this follows some of the beachhead logic model that was developed by CalSTART earlier, and the Drive to Zero campaign, which was around that you have, of course, first of all and foremost, being driven by urban areas and logistics hotspots. And you see different countries and different cities actually driving around zero-emission zones, or urban logistics and urban delivery are readily available. Vans, you can buy a smaller truck up to 3.5 tons, 7 tons, actually quite reasonably affordable, and they can be driven electric. Those will provide then the regional charging infrastructure along the corridors of that city. If you take those cities individually, they form at some point a form of agglomeration of different networks of different cities and different nodes, which gets into a regional logistics. And this also plays into what we saw in the previous slide, where the majority of all transport infrastructure for charging infrastructure is based on this regional type of logistics. So where charging will take place back in the depot, so going back to base type of operations versus actually overnight charging or on-the-go charging, which is a little bit more longer way, and also in the future, if you talk about the strategic rollout of this charging infrastructure. If you then take the regional logistics, that once you get to a reasonable regional logistics type of operations, you can imagine that, of course, then you start to integrate to a hub-to-hub corridor type of approach, which go beyond the current daily ranges that trucks can go, and therefore need a form of public charging infrastructure as they go. This will initially also be along the lines where bi-directional corridors can be taking place. So where there's a reasonably balanced transportation between two locations. And those will be the areas where we actually anticipate that charging infrastructure will be mostly be deployed. Whereas if you see at some point will be globally.
No, I was just very sorry to interrupt, but maybe we're up to your conclusions as we're a little bit behind.
This is literally at the final part of my presentation already. So this is where you'll see the final element of public charging infrastructure, which is the much needed, but is kind of the final stage of its development. So we really see the 3 stages of development, and we see this happen in following the same logic in Europe, but also following the same logic in the US, and even also in various other parts of the world, such as in India, emerging accordingly. So this was roughly what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regan. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, it's okay.
So I've noticed that we're terribly behind on schedule, but what I'm gonna suggest is this was the 4 pitches from our 4 speakers. So again, thank you so much. Next up on our agenda is the moderated discussion. So my suggestion would be, as it's already 16:43, says to merge the moderated discussion and the Q&A with the audience, so that the audience already also has enough time to ask their questions. So I'm going to invite everyone in the audience to, if they have any questions, start writing them down in the chat. I think we can maybe stop the recording, and then I will start off